Hi there, this is Teri from stampinmagic.com. Welcome back to my channel. Today's project is this beautiful Christmas card. It's a double gatefold card. It folds flat so it will easily fit into a standard size envelope, but it has this lovely unique shape to it. There's a space in the middle where you can write your message, and I've also done some partial die cutting with the Big Shot on this card. Now, one of the images has been glued directly onto the front of the card, and you could have done that with the other two images as well, but I wanted to do some partial die cutting and I wanted to show you how easy it is to do. So let's get started. I'm starting with two standard card bases. Now these are in our thick Whisper White cardstock and they've been scored down the centre as you normally would for a card base. Now on the inside of each, I've divided one of the sections in half again by drawing a pencil line down the middle. So for our A4 cardstock, I've drawn a line at 5.25 centimetres. Now these two card bases will eventually be joined together and you'll have one of these sections on each end. The small deer dies that I'm using come from the Detailed Deer Thinlits die set. Now the reason I drew the pencil lines is not only to help me position the plates for the Big Shot later, but also to position these deer. It will show me how much of the deer will be cut and how much will remain uncut. Now to further help me with positioning these dies, I've stamped and created some masks of these two deer. So I've used the images from the Dashing Deer stamp set and then I've cut them out with those same framelit dies. Now I stamped them onto masking paper. I'm just peeling off the backing here and then positioning my deer where I want them to be on the actual card. If you haven't got masking paper, then you could just use post-it notes. Now to get the top deer in the correct position, I'm just placing the deer I'm going to glue directly onto the front into position. And then I'm just using my ruler to ensure that the deer with the antlers will not overlap that deer that I'm going to stick flat to the card. And what I've tried to do is get that pencil line to go between the front and the back legs of each of the deer. Now when you position your dies, you'll notice that because we've got that masking paper already there, the dies just sort of slot over the top of that and it helps them stay in place. Now the area we're going to cut is the area towards the centre of the card. And now for the partial die cutting. So I'll bring my Big Shot in, and the sandwich we'll use is just the normal cutting sandwich for thin dies. So your Big Shot platform, your thin die adapter, and then an acrylic sheet. And then one of the card bases with the mask and the die in position. Now remember, we're cutting the section that is towards the centre of that card base. Now I'm going to line my plate up, my second acrylic plate, so the edge is on top of that pencil line, and the Big Shot will only cut what's underneath that plate. So it will just cut that first part of the deer. And then I'm going to repeat that process for the second die. So the same sandwich as before, and then I'm going to align that plate onto the pencil line. Now, one thing to note here is that I'm using beveled edged plates, so they slope down just slightly right at the very edge. Now, you may find that when you use the beveled edge plates that it doesn't actually cut up to the pencil line. So once you've run it through, just turn it over and check, and if it hasn't cut as much as you want, reinsert the die, make the sandwich again, and this time align the plate just a little bit past the pencil line. Okay, the next thing you want to do is to erase the pencil lines that you drew down both of the cards. The deer images and the sentiment that I'm using on this card all come from the Dashing Deer stamp set. For the stamping, I am going to use my Stamp-A-Magic handle and imaging sheet. Now, these are retired Stampin' Up products now, although the handle is available to buy from other retailers such as Amazon. Of course, you could use any stamp positioning tool for this, but you do need to be accurate with your stamping. The ink I'm going to use is black VersaFine. Now, I prefer to use this ink when I want a black embossing because it stays wet for a long time and you don't lose any fine detail with it. The first thing I need to do is remove the masks from the deer, and these I will save and I'll put them back on the acetate backing sheets for them and use them for other projects. Because I'm embossing, I'm using my embossing buddy just to remove any static from that cardstock. I've already prepared my imaging sheet with the images that we're going to stamp. So I'm aligning that first deer with the partial die cutting that we did on this card, and I've added the Stamp-A-Magic handle to that top left hand corner. Now I'm going to keep hold of that handle, ink up my stamp and stamp the image down and check it. Now once I stamped it I realised there was some bits missing, so as long as I haven't moved that handle I can go again and I stamp it a second time. Then I cover with embossing powder and just put to one side for now. Now the second image is exactly the same. I've got my imaging sheet prepared, so I'm aligning that with the partial die cutting on the card, add my handle to the top left hand side, ink up my stamp and stamp it down. And once I start stamping, I'm very careful not to move that handle, because if I want to repeat stamp, it needs to be in exactly the same place. And this time I overstamp it 2 more times. Now, if you want to find out more about using this Stamp-A-Magic, I do have a separate video for that, and I'll put a link to it at the top of the screen. Again, I'm adding embossing powder. And this is clear embossing powder, by the way. I always emboss black ink with clear powder to give me that black embossed look. I don't like black embossing powder. I find it very granular. It's not as fine as others. And then you can melt the powder using your heat tool. I'm now going to score the cards, and I'll be scoring them where I have that pencil line drawn, so it's at the halfway point on that first panel. I'm using my Simply scoreboard and I'm using the metric plate on top of it because that has a groove at the 5.25 centimetre mark. So I'm just following that groove and I'm scoring down through that card. I'm not scoring through the deer. You will see the stylus go over the deer, but I'm not pressing at all. And then for my second half, I'm turning it upside down so it's going to hit that 5.25 centimetre groove. And again, I'm just scoring straight down, but missing the deer's body and his nose. The trees that I'm using are from the Winter Woods stamp set, and I've already mounted these onto my Stamparatus. I'm going to stamp the trees onto what will be the middle panel of the card. So I've folded my card in half and then folded it back on itself. And I've done this to fit it into the Stamparatus. And then I need to anchor that in position. I already know where to place my cardstock. So I'm anchoring it with the magnets, and then I'm going to stamp it with smoky slate ink. The reason I'm using the Stamparatus for the trees is because I want to stamp them onto the front panels of the card as well, and I want them to be like a continuous sweep across the card when it's open. And this stamped perfectly the first time. If it hadn't done, then you could just re-ink your stamp if necessary and go again, and it'll stamp in exactly the same place. Now to stamp and emboss the sentiment, I've prepared the cardstock using my embossing buddy again, and then I'm just placing my imaging sheet where I want that sentiment to be stamped, adding the handle to the top left corner. I'm going to use VersaFine ink again, removing the imaging sheet and inking up my stamp, and then placing the stamp block in the Stampin' Magic handle and stamping down. Then I can add clear embossing powder and melt it with my heat tool. Now I can fold the cards on the remaining score lines. So initially I fold my first one in half, and then I fold that first panel back on itself and very carefully reinforce the fold with my bone folder. And then the second one is already folded in the center, so I'm just folding that front panel back, again using my bone folder to carefully reinforce it. Now I can add the two cards together, so that stamped middle panel will go onto the second panel of the first card, if that makes sense. Now when I do this, you can see that in the middle I've got a little gap, and I want to get rid of that. And the easiest way to do this is to just take a tiny strip off that inside edge of that second card. And this is just about 1/8 of an inch or a couple of mil. And then you can see when I put the card back together and close the front panels, that gap has gone. And now I can add glue to that section on the first card and position the second card over the top of it. I'm going to go back to the Stamparatus next, because I want to stamp the trees again, this time onto the front panels of the card. So I'm going to fold my card, and this time I'm going to tuck the deer inside so they don't get stamped on, although the bottom one wouldn't anyway. And then I'm going to anchor my cardstock using the magnets again, and I'm positioning the card in exactly the same place that I positioned it last time when I did the trees on that center panel. It's quite bulky, so it's a good job to have both the magnets there holding all the panels down as flat as possible. Then again I'm using smoky slate ink, and I'll stamp that down, giving it a good press. I'm now going to start on the moon. I have a large piece of masking paper here, and because this is backed with acetate, I'm unable to punch through it. So I'm just backing it with some copy paper here so I can punch a nice clean circle through it, and that circle I'll keep for my background later. Then I can remove the acetate backing from that masking sheet and position it over the trees on that centre panel. I'm going to colour the moon using sponge daubers, and I have one for each colour. And the colours I'm going to use are saffron, pumpkin pie and cherry cobbler. I'm going to start with the lightest colour first, so that's saffron, and I'll use my sponge dauber just to apply the ink inside that punched out circle onto my card. And I'm just applying this around the edges initially, but I'll gradually build up the colour. I want to leave a little bit of white in the centre of the moon. And then once I'm happy with how that looks, I'll add a little pumpkin pie, again starting at the edges and working inwards, but not going in as deep as I went with the saffron. Again, just gradually building that up. And then finally I'm going to switch to cherry cobbler and just add a little of this right around the edge. Once all the colours have been added, I can carefully peel back that masking paper just to have a look at the effect that I've got. And I thought I'd just add a little more cherry cobbler, just to make those edges a little darker. And then finally I'm going to take the saffron again, and I'm going to blend those colours together. And this gets rid of any sort of lines or brush strokes that there might be. And then I can peel off the masking paper completely. Before I finish the background on the card, I'm going to take the little shadow stamp from the Winter Wood set and ink that up using smoky slate, but I'm going to stamp off each time I use it as well, and I'm going to stamp it under the front panel trees and under the 3 deer. And this 3rd deer was just stamped onto scrap white cardstock and embossed in the same way the others were. I'm covering the moon with that circle that I punched out of the masking sheet, and this will protect it while I ink the background. I'm using 3 colours of ink for the background: Pool Party, Balmy Blue and Night of Navy. I'm going to sponge it, so I've cut a piece of sponge for each of the 3 colours. When I sponge, I pick up the ink and then I apply it using a light circular motion. If you press too hard when sponging, you'll find that your sponge leaves streaks and marks on the cardstock which are very difficult to blend out. I'm only going to sponge the top half of my card, so I'm taking the Pool Party in quite deep. I won't go as deep with the remaining colours, so the darker colour is concentrated more on the edges and on the top of the card. So I'm slowly working across the card, picking up more ink as I need it, and gradually building up the layers until I've got the look that I want. Then I'll switch to Balmy Blue ink, and I'll apply this in exactly the same way, just not going quite as deep into towards the middle of the card. I think I may have forgotten to mention earlier that as well as covering the moon with the mask, I also added the deer masks back on over the top of my stamping, again just to protect the edges from the sponging. And finally I'll switch to Night of Navy ink, and again this is mainly going to be applied right on the edges of the card. The scrap piece of cardstock I'm using under my left hand is just to stop me getting fingerprints on my card. I find that when I'm sponging my hands get really messy, so it's just to protect the card. Once the background's complete, I can remove the masks from the moon and from the deer. Before adding any glitter to my card, I'm just going to glue that third deer flat onto the front panel. Now I want to add lots of glitter to this card. I'm using the fine tip glue pen to do this, and all I'm doing is just adding little lines of glue onto the branches of the trees, and I'm going to do this right across the card on all the trees. And then the glitter I'm using is Dazzling Diamonds. I'm just going to work on one panel at a time because the glue does actually dry quite quickly, so you don't want to wait too long before adding your glitter. So I just sprinkle the glitter on and then tap off the excess. Now I also want to glitter the foreground on the front two panels. The middle panel I'll leave blank because that's where you will write your message. So it's just the two front panels. And again, I'm just going to use the fine tip glue pen and randomly add glue and then add my glitter. And finally, here is the card complete. There's lots of sparkle on this card. So what do you think? Are you going to give partial die cutting a go? I love the shape of this card, and also the fact that it folds completely flat and will fit in a standard size envelope. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this project. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notifications bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. Bye for now.